James Hoggan is here because we're right in the middle of a big propaganda drive. You're probably aware of the emails from the University of East Anglia, which are being spun as proof that the theory of climate change is bogus. Just as bogus as the theory of natural selection. James Hoggan's book deals, in fact, with the history of that propaganda drive, of which this latest episode is part. He's so accomplished that I'm forced to actually read his credits, which I usually do. I can come around. He's founder of the public relations firm, Hoggan and Associates, and a rarity as a progressive PR man, if I may say so, at least in this country. Okay. He's chair of Canada's most influential environmental organization, the David Suzuki Foundation, and trustee of the Dalai Lama Center for Peace and Education. He's also the chair of the Canadian chapter of the Climate Project, which is Al Gore's organization, and co-founder of climate change website desmogblog.com, which you may want to check out if you haven't already, and a sustainable energy website called energyboom.com. So he's definitely more than credentialed to speak on the subject he's going to address tonight. His book is Climate Cover-Up. So he's going to talk informally for a little while. This is what we usually do. And then the floor is yours to ask questions. So join me in welcoming James Hoggan.
Thank you. I'm going to sit on this stool if that's what I feel like. I should take my tie off. I'm finding myself in more and more meetings where I'm the only person in the entire room with all these business people with a tie. So here I am. It's like an old habit. So I wanted to thank Gavin Schmidt, who is here to kind of, I've had a few harrowing experiences with people who don't think climate change is happening. And so one of the things that I've taken to asking is if I come into a city, there's a climate scientist who's generous like Gavin to attend, just so I can talk about what it is I'm here to talk about, and somebody who has the scientific background can answer questions about the science. So it's thank you, Gavin, for coming, and I appreciate it. And we're gonna have dinner afterwards, right?
Yeah, that'd be great. Some of those emails were his.
So we can talk about the East Anglia emails, and Gavin can defend himself. And I just want to thank Mark, too, for helping out with this. It's something that I really enjoy talking about, and if there was only one of you here, I would enjoy talking about it. I want to kind of explain, before I tell you about this climate cover-up story, where I'm coming from and how I came to write this book. Climate Cover-Up is a story, it's a public relations story. And it's a story about the most widespread public relations confusion campaign or misinformation campaign that I've come across in my 35 years in the public relations business. It is I'm going to just give you the kind of cold notes of this, but you can get the broader story with all the kind of details and evidence from the book. This is a story about greed and irresponsibility on a massive scale. It's a story about media manipulation. It's a story of boatloads of coal and oil money being used to propagate fake science, pay legions of public relations people to undertake a campaign that's gone on over the past couple of decades in the United States, in Canada, and Europe, and I'm just aware of most of the English-speaking countries like Australia and New Zealand. But it's basically a worldwide campaign. And I'm kind of an accidental activist on this. I'm sort of a corporate public relations person. My wife and I are lawyers, and even though I practice PR, I've owned a very successful corporate public relations company for a lot of years. I won all sorts of awards from the corporate world for PR for companies. And I've worked for big industries on either side of environmental issues. I'm not what you'd consider an activist or the kind of person who would kind of go off on these types of tangents and get upset about something like this. But I've always thought, like, I have a reputation. I've won the best crisis communications for a business in North America a few years back, and I'm hired usually because I'm considered a real tough kind of advocate for my clients. But I've always thought that as a public relations person who's involved in debates about important public issues, that it's my job to balance advocacy with honesty. And I believe personally that that is actually in the best interest of my clients. So just even if I'm just looking at it from the point of view of my client, I think that's a good idea. But it's certainly a good idea just from an ethical point of view that my job is to make sure that people understand issues better, not that they're more confused about them. And just because my client's interests don't suit the facts doesn't give me a right to manipulate information. I mean, we're all entitled to our own opinions, but we're not all entitled to our own set of facts. And this story is basically a story about the manipulation, the deception, and the manipulation of facts. And it's basically, as far as I'm concerned, a kind of war on legitimate science. It's not a story about a debate and a bunch of people on the other side of the debate that I don't agree with. So that I actually call this public relations Darth Vader PR. So because it's basically PR that's all about advocacy that isn't balanced by honesty. And you have no idea how much time public relations put into things that are innocently described as messages. You know, you probably heard the phrase junk science. That's one of the most heavily researched phrases in the English language. Hundreds of thousands of dollars have gone into that phrase. Junk science, sound science, those things, those are phrases that industries have paid massive amounts of money to test. They know the kind of impact that it has on people, and they use them. You know, it's just right straight out of 1984. Anyway, so this whole thing started for me kind of innocently. My wife absolutely hates this whole thing that I'm involved in. She's a labor lawyer who's on the Human Rights Commission in BC, in British Columbia, where I'm from, which is sort of a very highly public and very sensitive position that she's in. So to have me kind of, you know, slammed in 2-page spreads in the local right-wing newspaper is not her idea of, like, fun. But you know, I started out quite innocently. We were doing a website for Hoggan and Associates about 5 years ago. And somebody said, you know, we should do a community service site, something, or page. So let's find something that's, you know, maybe, you know, controversial, and, you know, offer some kind of communications help on it. And one other person in the office said, well, why don't we do it on climate change? So this was 5 years back, or 4.5 years back, so before Inconvenient Truth and the Nobel Prize and the Academy Award and that whole series of IPCC reports that showed the certainty at 90% up from 66%. So this was back when there was a lot more controversy, and you looked in the media, and almost all the media coverage was, yes, it's happening, no, it's not happening. So I thought, well, that's a good idea, you know, naively, and so I had to put this on my website, so I was forced in to start doing all this reading that, you know, I would normally not do. And I was stunned at what I found, that there really wasn't a controversy. You know, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, NASA, the National Academy of Sciences, the Royal Society of Canada. The list just goes on and on of all of these major scientific academies around the world who had decided that the climate was changing, humans had something to do with it, and it was something we need that was potentially very dangerous. And so I was kind of shocked because in the mainstream media, I saw all this controversy. So I kept reading, and I came across this book by an American named Ross Gelspan, who's he's from Boston, and he was an editor of the Boston Globe. And I was reading through it, and I think it's in his 3rd chapter, he starts talking about catching a number of these climate change deniers lying to him. And one particular guy, I think, was Fred Singer that he caught lying. Fred Singer, you know, he's a climate change denier and a climate change expert who used to work for the tobacco industry doing similar things for tobacco. So I started reading this and I looked at other things and I saw the fingerprints of public relations people all over this campaign. So right around that time I ran into this quote that I want to read to you. The scientific basis for the greenhouse effect and the potential impact of human emissions of greenhouse gases such as CO2 on the climate is well established and cannot be denied. So that was not Al Gore. That was written by Mobil Corporation's most senior scientist in a 1995 report for an energy industry front group called the Global Climate Coalition. Now, the PR guy undoubtedly, who commissioned this report didn't like what it said, so it ended up being stuffed into a drawer until Andy Revkin wrote about it earlier this year in the New York Times. And right at that time that report came out, this Global Climate Coalition was engaged in this very aggressive public relations campaign to confuse the public about climate science. And in spite of this report, they kept up doing what they were doing for 7 more years until 2002. So this, to me, when I looked at this is so similar to the kind of stuff that you remember reading about or seeing on television about the tobacco industry, right? Where they're burying these scientific reports that link tobacco with cancer. So I got really upset about it, and I have this very wealthy friend, and I'm embarrassed to say that he and I were flying to Europe on his jet. And I gave him Ross's book, and I said, you should read this chapter in this book. And we don't fly on his jet anymore. We've decided we've learned too much about climate change, and now we try to be much more responsible people. But so he read this, you know, and he's the kind of guy who gets angry pretty easily. So he got angry too. And there was other people, and we all started having this conversation. And he said, well, what should we do about this? And I said, you know something, I just read about these things called blogs in Fortune magazine. And there was this article on blogs. I had never heard of blogs. I didn't know what a podcast was or anything. And so I said, why don't let's set up a blog. So we set up this blog, and it was called Desmog Blog. In the first year, we had 120,000 unique visitors, which for us, I mean, this was out of, you know, one single little office in my PR company in Vancouver. The next year, we had 800,000 unique visitors. Then the year after that, we had 1.4, and this year we'll probably have 2 million unique visitors. So it's a very popular climate change blog, especially when you consider the fact that it's really about climate. Our tagline is cleaning up the PR pollution that clouds climate science. So it's not like there's a huge audience, you know, for this subject matter, right? So the fact that it caught on the way it did was quite a surprise to us. And that is basically what this book is about, is what we wrote about on this blog. And I wanted to tell you, give you kind of a couple of examples of what we write about in the book. But it is really well documented. There's good evidence in the book. And the book is basically about PR campaigns selling doubt. And one of the first examples of it that we ran into was some work done by a public relations guy named Frank Luntz. I don't know if you've ever heard of him. He's an American who's a language specialist. And this is some advice that he gave to the Republican Party in 2002. He was saying that the public believes that there isn't any consensus on climate science among scientists. And so, and this is his phrase, you need to continue to make the lack of scientific certainty a primary issue in the debate. Now, these guys, these salesmen of doubt, have done an incredible job. And the reason I think that this book is important is that these people are shaping public policy in your country and in mine. These people are the reason that nothing is going to be done in Copenhagen. I don't know if you followed that news announcement on the Pew Research about 2 or 3 weeks ago, where they said that the number of Americans who think the science is solid on climate change has dropped from 71 to 57%. And the number of Americans who believe that humans are causing it has dropped from 46 to 35%. Now, trying to find, direct causal links in the world of sociology and psychology is kind of a mug's game at the best of times. But there's no question in our minds, the way when we follow this very closely, that these people are really having an impact in the way that the media is covering this and the way that people are thinking about it. So, this is actually taking place at a time when the science is becoming more solid. Hey, what are you doing here? This is...
Hear about the great book.
So, this is a... this is happening at a time when the science is becoming more solid. And this is happening at a time when scientists, and Gavin, you can tell us maybe, that people who I know or who are climate scientists say things are happening faster than expected, and they're getting more concerned. Is that a fair characterization?
Some things are going faster than you thought, some things aren't. I mean, my opinion is that it's going pretty much as we anticipated. I don't see that it's that radically different from what we said 5 years ago or even 15 years ago. Details are changing. Aspects are becoming clearer, and some of the mismatches are becoming clearer. But there's a bit of a meme that's going around that says it's worse than we thought, and that gets people's attention and it works. But it's not, unless you're being very specific about what it is you're talking about. I don't think it's a general point that should be made.
But the science isn't going in a direction that people should be less concerned about climate change.
No, people should have been concerned about climate change 15 years ago.
Right. So, and in our view, it's no wonder that people are confused. We have, over the last documented an industry that's been working over the last couple of decades that hired legions of public relations people, compliance scientists, to make this confusion about climate science part of the public understanding of the climate change issue. And to make this lack of scientific certainty the kind of primary issue in people's minds. And that continues today. In particular, we found 3 public relations strategies. One of them came from the coal industry, another one came from the American Petroleum Institute, and one surprisingly came from Philip Morris. So the first one I want to tell you about started with a group called the Western Fuels Association. They partnered with the National Coal Association and the Edison Electrical Institute to create something called ICE, the Information Council on the Environment. And ICE had 2 goals. Its first goal was to reposition global warming as a theory, not a fact. And then secondly, to supply alternative facts to support that global warming would be good. So they had a PR company. They have a PR company called Bracey Williams & Co. from Washington. And based on their advice, ICE went into small U.S. markets and did focus groups. That's something that people in the public relations business like to do, so we can develop messages. And they tested a series of messages. And these are the messages they tested. This formed the basis of a massive advertising campaign. So here's the first message. Some say the Earth is warming. Some also said the Earth was flat. Who told you the Earth was warming? Chicken Little? Or if the Earth is warming, why is the frost line moving south? So we all know that the frost line actually wasn't moving south, unfortunately for us. But that wasn't the point, because they weren't testing these messages for accuracy. They were testing them for impact. And they came up with some very compelling messages. Basically, if you look at the advertising campaign, it was built around these messages. And like all good public relations people, when they're doing focus groups, you also test your spokespeople. So what they found, not surprisingly, was that people didn't trust government or people didn't trust industry spokespeople when they were talking about the environment. So they hired, but they did trust technical people. So these guys decided to hire compliant scientists, basically people with PhDs and lab coats, to be spokespeople for them, and to do broadcast interviews and newspaper articles to support all this advertising they were doing. So that one was bad enough. But another document we found, this one was done by Philip Morris. And this is actually in the tobacco papers. So you can find this. If you just Google tobacco papers, you can get all the kind of background on this. Now, big tobacco, as most of us know, almost invented lying and misleading the public. They turned it into almost like an art form. If you remember, in the early 90s, that was a time when people were stopping smoking in droves. And government was actually trying to regulate against smoking in public because of the dangers of secondhand smoke. So, and people had stopped believing tobacco executives. Now, let me just stop for a second here. There's a thing that maybe is just something that fascinates me and no one else. But if you look at the last 2 decades, and you look at public confidence in industry, then there's a line that just goes like this. People in growing numbers mistrust industry and industry associations. And if you're an industry that is trying to protect your interests, that puts you in an extremely difficult position. And so they turn to people like me. And you know, depending on just exactly what kind of ethics you have, you may end up doing some kind of work that may not actually be that socially progressive. So they turned to, this is Philip Morris, they turned to a company called APCO Worldwide. And APCO said, okay, so the public doesn't trust you, but they do trust scientists. And so let's put together a group. And they called it the Advancement of Sound Science Coalition. This is kind of, to me, this is the birthplace of a lot of this. And this Advancement of Sound Science Coalition, it wasn't, if it was only paid for by Philip Morris, and Philip Morris was its only benefactor, it wouldn't have looked that good. So what they did was they sent out 20,000 invitations to other business leaders to join this fight for sound science and this fight against junk science. And they included, along with junk science around secondhand smoke and tobacco, junk science around climate change, around genetically modified foods, around packaging, And the list just goes on and on. So rather than being an argument about whether or not cigarettes cause or cigarettes are good for you or cigarettes cause cancer, they shifted it. And this is what public relations people are very, very good at, just kind of shifting the message just a little bit and nudging your thinking a whole lot on some really important issues. So this group was where, I'm trying to remember his name now. I've got it here someplace. Steve Malloy, the junk man. He's like a Fox News guy now. And he's Fox News guy who basically talks about this whole junk science issue. To me, this is a part of their strategy is to present themselves as grassroots. And this is it's a good disguise for them, right? But understand, the Montgomery Improvement Association that supported Rosa Parks was a community group. This was a grassroots group. This is an AstroTurf group. 100% fake grass. This is not grassroots. This is basically all constructed for business purposes. And I think that's a really important point. People argue with me quite a bit about whether or not I'm actually opposing people's right to a point of view. That I disagree, and so I'm trying to undermine their right to say what they think. I'm more in opposition to pretending you're something you're not. You can say whatever you want to, just don't tell me you're like a climate scientist if you're not. And don't tell me that you're a scientist if you're somebody who's basically getting paid by industry to say what it is you're saying. And don't tell me that what you're saying is science if it's not science. Otherwise, you can say whatever you want to. I think, fine, we should have public debates, even about science. But what we're talking about and what we write about in this book is a fake debate. This is a debate that's actually been constructed by public relations people. So this group, these were some of their goals. Established task, the Advancement of Science Coalition, established task as a credible source for reporters when questioning the validity of science, and encourage the public to question from the grassroots up the validity of scientific studies. So, another point I want to make here is that there's no intent here to challenge the validity of the science by actually doing science, right? This wasn't a laboratory strategy. This, again, is public relations. So, there was one other, and I'll just tell you this one really quickly because it's a very similar one. But this was also a big campaign. This was put together by the American Petroleum Institute, and they hired Steve Malloy, who was by this time he was the executive director of TASC. So they hired him away, and he started another group called the Global Climate Science Communications Plan, and they basically they hired scientists who were willing to be paid to go do these media interviews to make the claim that climate change wasn't actually happening. They gave them media training to increase their credibility, and they sent them into these small markets where reporters are easier to buffalo. And they got caught with this plan and said, we're not going to implement it. But if you look at the history of API, quite right around that time they started rolling out these scientists mainly with PhDs, but not with climate science credentials, and basically hired them to go talk to the media on their behalf. And this was their mission statement in this plan. They said that victory would be achieved. Now that doesn't sound like much in the way of kind of like science or education. Victory would be achieved when we make uncertainty about climate science part of the conventional wisdom in the media and the general public. So to me, in effect, when they say something like that, they're saying that we're not about science education. This is about science confusion. They were another group that try to present themselves as grassroots and hide the connection to oil and gas. So once you actually start to understand these techniques, you start to see them everywhere. This summer, API was caught stacking meetings with energy industry employees. To me, the thing that these guys don't do is they don't tell you who they really are. That is the issue for me. It's more about transparency than it is about what they're saying. So I think in Canada and in the United States, we allow this kind of deception, and then there's no laws against it. Like, you can go out and lie to people like this, and it's not illegal. If you were a lobbying firm, you have to actually declare who you're representing. But these astroturfing firms don't. There's exemptions in your legislation in Washington and in our legislation in Canada. So these groups that can have far more influence on legislation are able to, carry these pickets and raise hell on television and raise hell in these communities. I mean, Bonner and Associates were caught. Have you guys heard about Bonner and Associates? This story about Bonner and Associates? So API wasn't behind this. A group called the Americans for Clean Coal Electricity was behind this. They hired a PR firm called Hawthorne, who in turn hired this group called Bonner and Associates. Bonner and Associates is one of these K Street PR firms. You ever been to K Street in Washington, D.C.? K Street goes on for a frightening distance. And it's all of these kind of when you shake hands with somebody down there, it's, and I remember thinking, like, is this guy like a lawyer? Is he a PR guy, or is he a lobbyist, right? And they're all three, right? And there's just building after building all the way down K Street filled with these lobbying and AstroTurf groups. So they hired Bonner and Associates, and Bonner and Associates specializes in pickets. So I saw a PR plan that they did for the tobacco industry in 1988, where they were charging $1,800 a picket. They were charging $75 a letter. This was in the late 80s. These guys make massive amounts of money. Anyway, what they do is they set up these phone rooms filled with low-paid employees who phone around these communities and say, I'm phoning on behalf of your such and such a local seniors firm or seniors society, and we're opposed to the Waxman-Markey bill because it's going to cause $4 a gallon gas. It's going to drive heating through the roof, and we want you to join us. They don't say we're actually a Washington-based public relations firm. They don't say that. Anyway, so they got caught though because they also got a little bit carried away and enthusiastic, and they started forging letters from seniors firms. So they stole the letterhead, wrote these letters to oppose the legislation, and forged the signature of the executive director of these legitimate community groups. So,
We should leave time for people to
sure.
ask you questions.
Yeah. So basically, I'm happy to take any questions. But my view is that we should insist that these groups are stripped of this right to hide their funding, that we should start to demand more of business leaders and say that you shouldn't be financing this kind of deceptive activity. We should be suggesting to political leaders that they should be resisting this kind of manipulation, and that we personally should be speaking out about this kind of thing whenever we see it, because otherwise we just allow these people to kind of hijack honest public conversations, and eventually they end up being the ones who are shaping our public policies. And you know, they can tell you all they want to about being against government interference and all that, but the fact of the matter is they're the ones who are actually, they've shaped this lack of any kind of climate legislation problem that the American delegation is taking all the way to Copenhagen. So anyway, so I'm happy to answer any questions you might have.
I look at it more of a dilation.
What?
A dilation. Climate change, a dilation. That industry has responsibility for keeping up with, yes, keeping green, but not to stop progression, if you will. Just progression of the hominid unit, because you know, PBS says the sun is getting larger and things are changing, and I think it's all magnetic. I think the world knows that it's changing, and it won't allow too much. It won't allow too much change. But I don't see anything wrong with industry, I guess. You know, as long as there's something positive being done. Better vehicles, for example, more efficient vehicles. Of course, go green. I'm not against that. But I guess I don't know. I never understood so much, and if you could explain to me, the big hoopla around climate change.
Take it away.
The big hoopla. Well, so is that a question for you? The big hoopla. What is the big hoopla? So I would say that I don't disagree with you. I actually agree with you.
I believe in responsibility.
I agree with you that jobs are good.
Yes, sir.
And you know, green technology is good.
Yes, sir.
So is the environment, though. And I think that there are a lot of people who are very concerned about the climate change issue and the impact that it's going to have on the environment around the world, that it is having on the environment around the world. And my book is basically about a lot of folks who would rather we didn't know much about it. And it's not really intended to be anti-corporate.
Okay, yes, sir.
It's not really that.
Sure, that's good.
Yes.
I'm curious what you think the role of all these industries will have in Copenhagen if they're organizing. I assume the deception continues, their work continues. How does that get combated or addressed? You know, when people are actually trying to move policies forward to address climate change.
My sense is the damage has been done. That these groups actually start long before we hear about it, and in their own countries. So there was a really interesting woman that I met in Washington who has a website called Fire Dog Lake, and she basically had this diagram that she drew on a napkin for me, saying, this is why these groups are so effective. And there was this arrow on it. This is the sort of public debate out here. This is this big arrow. And then right at the very beginning, there were all these little dots that she said, when the legislation or the policy is being shaped behind the scenes, it's done more directly back here. Here is where most NGOs get involved. So this is where the public debate happens. The reason that there's such a real direct kind of arrow in her diagram, she said, is that if you have somebody like Koch Industries, the reason that they're willing to put millions and millions of dollars into these campaigns is that there's a 30 or 40 billion dollar prize right at the end of this. But if you engage here, it's too late. That here is where Copenhagen is. In fact, it's actually a little bit beyond here. And so I think that these people will be there. They'll be in the coffee shops, but the damage that they did was months ago. And in some cases, in the case of some of these people we write about, in the early 90s, they started to do this damage. When you have public, it seems to me that the reason that public opinion is a really important thing, and the reason we need to resist these confusion campaigns, is that public opinion ultimately shapes political will. And if public opinion is, if a large enough percentage of the public continues to be confused about something like this, then it's just much easier for this process to just go the normal kind of direction that it goes in, and these lobbyists to have an inordinate amount of power with very little political downside. I think there are a growing number of people who are in the Al Gore camp and who are very concerned about climate change, and some people who are concerned about climate change who aren't in the Al Gore camp. So there is some, there is some hope that it's that Copenhagen may lead to some kind of political agreement, and that halfway through next year, maybe towards the end of next year, that we will have an international treaty. But it's not going to have the teeth that it needs to have. Yes. Sorry.
Well, sorry. I have a couple of questions specifically. I'm curious about the role of some of these astroturf groups in NGOs. I do some formal organizing about I did some about the Western Markey Bill, and I was really shocked to see a lot of NGOs like scouting targets that were dramatically lower than what scientists say that we need to hit, the 40% reduction below 2020. Most NGOs are asking for like a 20-25% reduction by 2020. So I'm curious if you could speak to that.
You mean that some of these people have infiltrated?
Yeah, and even I guess I heard that you're on the board or something with the climate project
In Canada, yes.
Okay, so I just know that, for example, Al Gore's campaign here in the U.S., the We Can Solve It campaign, is now, it's quite shocking. He went from calling for 10 years to 100% renewable energy to supporting carbon sequestration. So it seems like
he's moved off that now.
Oh, had he?
Off carbon.
Okay.
I just heard him talking about it in Toronto.
Okay. Well, that's encouraging. Like, actually fairly shocked.
Yes.
And so I'm curious if you could speak to, like, if there's a filtration happening within NGOs.
I think two things here. The first thing is that people's thinking is evolving on this. So I've heard the same thing in Montreal when Gore came up a couple of years ago to do training in Canada, and he got in a big argument with David Suzuki on the stage about carbon sequestration. And Suzuki was very upset about the idea that we'd be pumping all this carbon back down into the ground without actually knowing what the impact was going to be. So that's one point of view. And then you have the other point of view, well, if you don't have carbon sequestration, you're going to have a big problem trying to control greenhouse gas emissions from coal. So you absolutely have to have it. I don't know. I mean, so
the third option of absolutely
just green.
shutting them down.
That's right. Yeah. So that, just setting that aside, I would say to your other question, there's a great website called PR Watch that was based on exactly what you're talking about. Some work that this guy who started PR Watch, John Stauber, he wrote a book called "Toxic Sludge is Good for You," and he caught this kind of infiltration thing going on in local community groups, and they were basically, I think they were Burson Marsteller, so a PR firm's people infiltrated these community groups and were sort of posing as concerned community people, and they weren't. So it wouldn't surprise me at all. I don't have any examples of it, but I think it's something you want to be watching out for. The real issue, though, is not the argument over these massive, these targets, when we're essentially doing nothing. I mean, basically, we are doing nothing. You're not doing anything in the United States. Maybe at a municipal level, and to a certain degree at a state level. Same in Canada, but still, ultimately, when you look at the scope of the problem, federal governments around the world are doing very little about this problem. I mean, there's a lot of talk going on, but greenhouse gas emissions, with all of these great policies and treaties and discussions and everything, are just going like that. So I think, what the ultimate solution is in terms of numbers is less important than why is it that we seem to be able to, that we don't seem to be able to actually get off our butts and do something about this, right?
Well, just kind of clarify my question, I guess. there's some activists I know here in the city that have like really formed, how do I say this? So James Hansen, is one who said it's better not to pass any climate bill this year that has cap and trade. It's better, And he's also kind of coming out rather publicly, and a lot of people are coming out publicly really trashing organizations like One Sky, the We Campaign, all this stuff, and saying that, and I haven't done the research, so I'm curious if you have, saying that there's a fair amount of money going from gas, coal, oil industries to pay these NGOs to do something, but to do it kind of at a minimal level that's not that impactful and keeps their interests in mind.
Well, I don't know that, but it's certainly a story I'll look into.
Smog blog, but
I think there's a real danger here. I mean, it's clear that there is this fake. Right? There's these arguments which are non-arguments, there are these facts which are non-facts, and it's clear that people are being paid to lie and foment uncertainty where there is no uncertainty, basically. It's a very dangerous thing then to say that just because that debate is fake, that all debates are fake. Right? This is a really, really complicated question, and it isn't something where the answer is obvious, and it isn't something where if anybody just studied the thing, they're just going to come to exactly the same conclusion. It's so complicated, and there are so many costs and benefits to weigh, both in terms of the economy, in terms of air pollution, in terms of the different kinds of fossil fuels, in terms of how we live our life. I mean, and whatever solutions, not one solution, whatever solutions we come up with, it's always going to be a balance, and it's not really clear which ones of those are going to work out for the best ahead of time, right? It's a big problem, and it's a big project, and it's going to take a long time to fix. And so it's important, I think, to be aware that sensible people can still come to different conclusions about how best to proceed, right? And I think your point about the difference between coming up with targets and actually doing something is completely apropos, right? The people at One Sky, I know some of those people, they're not being paid by the oil and gas industry
I know.
Right, and I know Jim Hansen very well, and he's not being paid to be obstructionist. But I disagree with him on his stand, because I think personally, my reading of the situation is that it is better to have something that we can tweak and then make stronger in exactly the same way that we did with the ozone depletion issue. Right? Everyone thinks, we signed the Montreal Protocols to ban CFCs and aerosol cans and fridges and things. But we didn't. What was signed in Montreal was an agreement to change the rate of growth from this to this, right? And then 2 years later, it went to that. And then 2 years after that, it went to this. And then 2 years after that, they decided to cancel it out. It was like a 10-year process, and that was a much simpler problem, right? This is a much more complicated problem, and it's going to be more than a 10-year process.
You see the basic problem here? What you just said, which is eminently sensible and intelligent and informed, far too complicated to register in the sphere where your colleagues operate, because they operate in a world of radical simplicity. They make simple points. You're talking about complication, right? And really, what this book seems to be about, aside from climate change, is democracy and public opinion, and the question of how we can possibly engage as a public in a rational discussion of vital issues when the media system is basically an echo chamber for these interests. I mean, this really comes down to your question. The issue that you raised is the fundamental one. You posed the question, well, maybe we shouldn't knock corporations because they create jobs and they make cars.
Sure.
Well, that's right. That's why even put it that way? Why even frame it that way? The fact is that the possibility of some kind of radical environmental breakdown, I mean a real collapse, is off the table. It's not discussed. And it's not discussed because there are very powerful players, who don't see it as being in their interests to let people talk about it. It isn't just this issue. How many of you are aware? I mean, I'm not a scientist. Okay, I'm only a media critic. How many of you are aware of the extent of sound scientific evidence suggesting that cell phone use has, possible lethal side effects? But, mostly what people say is, when they're being honest, that's what I said, is, well, I mean, didn't they discover that there was really nothing to that? That's what people usually say. Wasn't there a scare about that, and people figured then that there was nothing to it? Well, that's how propaganda, PR, whatever you want to call it, it works, by kind of coming into the side of your mind. You kind of hear something, I kind of heard this, isn't this what happened? Well, as a matter of fact, there's a book called Cell Phones by a scientist named George Carlo, who was hired by the cell phone industry to do research on this very question. Does cell phone use maybe cause brain tumors? He discovered, according to his research, that they do not. And they went and they ran with that. And that was all over the press. There's no link. But that's not all he discovered. He also found evidence that they do cause tumors under the skin, around here, okay? That they didn't mention. So what did he do? Now, he wrote a book about this, right? He called all the reporters who had run these big stories, basically, echoing the talking point of the cell phone industry, and he said, listen, I actually found other stuff that they didn't mention that wasn't in your piece. I really think, in the interest of public health, blah, blah, blah. Not a word. Nothing was reported because they called back their sources in the cell phone industry, and they said, oh, he's a crank. He's disgruntled. He's pissed off. He's crazy. Whatever they said. And it was, of course, in their interest, I think this is unconscious, to listen to them because they're huge advertisers. So he writes a book about it. Was it reviewed anywhere? No. I only found out about it because he was on C-SPAN Book TV talking about this. So it isn't just climate change, right?
Right. I actually don't think I don't consider this a book about climate change. This is a book about, it's basically a book about the corruption of public conversations. And it seems to me that I'm all for, I actually think that we need more debate about things like climate change, certainly about climate change. But what we don't need is a perverted debate. So we don't need people, part of the debate, who are pretending to be something they actually aren't. And when it's really important. So it's really important, don't you want to know, who's actually representing, who people are actually representing?
How do you propose to make this change?
Well, I think, there was the Christian right in the United States lobbied to exclude grassroots from lobbying legislation. And that it shouldn't be excluded, it should be included. So if you basically knew who these phony grassroots organizations were representing, a lot of this problem would go away. Because the problem is, these people are allowed to actually say things that no CEO would say. They're restricted by all sorts of securities laws that'll stop them from telling the kind of lies that some of these groups are telling. There's certain companies who'll be absolutely saying one thing to the public, say like Toyota. So absolutely saying one thing about green technology to the public at the same time that they're supporting a lawsuit against greenhouse gas emissions in California, right? These kinds of links, I think, just need to be. We need to figure out some way to just make them more transparent. Is my view.
The role of journalists to make these things transparent?
Well, you can. Yeah, no, I don't think that. Well, I mean, you can. There's a lot of causes. There's, a big chicken and egg, a series of chicken and egg questions here. I think that you could ask. Newsrooms are shrinking. Most journalists are scientifically illiterate. They don't ask who's, are you being paid by any industry? When somebody comes up and they're disagreeing with the world's scientific community and they're not really a climate scientist, they aren't doing climate science and they're being paid by industry and they're interviewed on national television or by a national publication and no one even asks them. Now that comes because you basically have these shrinking newsrooms. These guys don't have enough time. They're not really competent, so you can't have beat reporters who really understand the area. You know, not everybody has Andy Revkin, who can afford Andy Revkin, right? So the Vancouver Sun is just inundated by these people, right? So I think ultimately, why would you not have, if you've got lobbying legislation, why would you not have legislation that also requires these guys to register and maybe has some kind of code that says that, you know, this is where you're stepping over the line. I think you basically have to regulate it.
Ask about legislators specifically. Are we then to treat them as simply sort of dupes? Are they buying the information they're fed? Is it, or are they just conduits of the will of their constituencies? The people themselves are duped, and so the legislators are forced to act. Can we treat them as having personal opinions and conscience on these matters?
Politicians are basically a reflection of societal thinking, and so there's limits to what they can and can't do. So it's really our responsibility, not so much their responsibility. I mean, it's not, you know, this is a generalization, but not so much their responsibility as our responsibility. And if we don't understand things enough to have kind of a working understanding of what the problem is, then it's, I mean, I know in Canada we have something like 80% of Canadians who think that climate change is happening and they're really worried about it. If you ask what climate change is, the most common answer has something to do with the hole in the ozone, right? So if you think that climate change is caused by the hole in the ozone, what is the solution? I don't know.
The fishing industry.
And so basically what happens then is you have then the people who are going to influence the government, has the number of people has shrunk. So you basically have excluded yourself as the public, and you have these powerful lobbying forces. And the lobbying forces on the business side of things are just much better. They're much better funded, and they have much more influence. And politics is driven by public opinion. Ultimately, I think you can't expect politicians to go too far in front of the public.
There's a difference between Canada and the United States. We have a much more corrupt legislature than you do. It isn't just public opinion. There, on issue after issue, there's a solid majority of popular support in terms of
Yes.
the public option.
Yeah.
And the Congress is not responsive to that. They're much more responsive to the people who donate to their campaigns.
But